Well now, friend, settle yourself in. You found your way to the Redacted Archives, that place where we keep the stories that the mountains don't quite want to let go of. My name don't much matter anymore, and what I'm about to share with you concerns a man named Silas, a surveyor by trade, and a hollow place in these Appalachian hills they call the Marrow-Thicket. This here is case file 079. Now, I'll tell you true, this ain't a story meant to frighten you sudden-like. No, sir. This is the kind of tale that settles into your bones slow and patient, like cold seeping through old cabin walls come November. So dim your lights down low and listen close to the recovered audio that follows. They found what was left of Silas Hartwell 3 years after he disappeared into the Marrow-Thicket. He stood at the ridge line above the creek bed, thin as a stripped sapling, his skin the color of hemlock bark, weathered gray by 10,000 seasons. His eyes were still open, still looking down into those hollows where the mist never quite clears. There was no mark upon him, no wound, no blood. Just a man who had become something else entirely. Something that belonged to the mountain in a way the living never could. The old folks whispered that if you listen careful on certain nights, you can still hear him breathing with the wind through the pass. A sound like air moving through hollowed bone. Silas Hartwell came to these mountains in late autumn of 1987, carrying his survey equipment and the kind of confidence that only a man who'd never truly suffered can hold. He was hired to map the eastern reaches of the Marrow-Thicket, a stretch of land so tangled that even the county didn't rightly understand what lay within it. The timber companies wanted to know if it was worth taking. Silas had done this work before, tramped through Pennsylvania forests and Virginia hollows, but he'd never been to the Marrow-Thicket. He hadn't heard the stories, or if he had, he hadn't believed them, the way young men don't quite believe the stories their elders tell with such care and such sadness. The locals tried to warn him. There was an old woman at the last settlement before the trail went wild. She sat on a porch that was barely holding itself together, and she looked at Silas with eyes that had seen things that never made it into the official records. "Don't go down into them hollows after the sun passes certain trees," she said. Her voice was thin, like wind through a crack in old wood. The mountain don't like strangers in the thicket, and it's got ways of dealing with folks who don't respect the silence. Silas smiled the way young men do when they think they're being kind to someone afraid of the dark. He thanked her and drove as far as he could up a winding road. The rest he'd have to do on foot. The weather was fair to middling that morning. Cool, but not yet what you'd call cold. The mist hung in the hollows like something that had learned to breathe. And the trees, Lord, the trees were so tall and so thick that it was hard to remember what the sky looked like. Hemlock trees mostly, dark as old blood against the gray sky. The ground was soft with needles and damp with something that wasn't quite rain. Silas marked his trail as he went, cutting blazes into the bark with his surveying knife. He looked through his telescope at distant ridges, and he walked. Lord, how he walked. It was around the time the sun started thinking about leaving for the day that he realized he couldn't quite remember which direction was back. This don't happen to surveyors, you understand. They're trained to keep their sense of direction like a compass keeps pointing north. But the Marrow-Thicket has a way of turning a man's mind like a key in a lock. The hollows all look the same. The ridges double back on themselves in ways that don't quite make sense. And the mist gets thicker as evening comes, until you can't quite remember if you've been walking for 2 hours or 2 days. Silas found himself on a rocky slope where the ground gave way beneath his feet. He was reaching for a hemlock to catch himself when the slope decided it was done holding him up. He fell down, tumbling through darkness and branches, and every rock he hit was colder than the last, until finally there was nothing beneath him but air. He landed in the creek bed below, and something in his left leg gave way with a sound like a branch snapping. The pain was the kind that makes you see colors that don't exist in the natural world. The creek was cold. Not the clean cold of a mountain spring, but something deeper and older. Silas lay there on the stones, his leg twisted beneath him, the mist rising up around him like something curious and slow. He must have lain there for hours, and that's when he heard it. Not a sound exactly, but a rhythm. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the rocky creek bed, and beneath it, a sliding, scraping sound. A figure emerged from the mist. The man was tall and bent, and he moved with a kind of slowness that suggests every movement is being carefully considered. His clothes were old, not just worn, but old in a way suggesting decades. And his hands were large, with fingers that bent in directions fingers shouldn't bend. "You've hurt yourself," the figure said. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together in a riverbed. The mountain don't take kindly to trespassers that don't respect the fallen down places. Silas tried to speak, but the pain made it come out as a whimper. The figure knelt beside him and began to examine the broken leg with surprising gentleness. "Name's Bone Setter," the figure said. "Old Bone Setter. I live in the thicket. Been living here since before your granddaddy was born, reckon. I know how to fix what the mountain breaks. Silas should have been afraid of this creature that emerged from the dark like something that belonged more to the landscape and to the human world. But fear and pain and desperation can make a man accept things he ordinarily wouldn't. "Can you help me?" Silas asked. The bone setter smiled, and it was a smile without warmth in it. "I can help you," he said, "but it'll cost you." "I've got money," Silas started. But the bone setter wasn't talking about money. "What I'm talking about is something different. I'm going to set your bones true, but you're going to have to accept my methods. No doctors, no modern medicines, just the old way, the mountain way." Silas, lying there in the dark with his legs screaming in pain, agreed. The bone setter's home was built into the side of a hollow, where an overhang of stone created shelter, and where hemlock trees grew so thick they seemed to have woven themselves into a roof. The structure itself was hard to look at. It seemed to shift depending on the angle of your gaze, as if it wasn't quite sure what shape it wanted to be. The bone setter carried Silas there, moving slow and careful, his strength surprising in something that looked so bent and ancient. Inside, the place smelled like earth and age, like things that had been growing and dying in the dark for a very long time. There were shelves carved into the stone walls, and on those shelves were jars, hundreds of them, filled with pale, hard, bone-colored things. "Don't worry yourself about those," the bone setter said. "Those are the tools of my trade. Been collecting them for a long, long time. Every piece of old bone in this mountain seems like makes its way to me eventually. The mountain gives, the mountain takes, and the mountain remembers." The bone setter laid Silas on a bed made of straw and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like bone beneath the covering. And then, with movements that were practiced and sure, he began to work. He removed Silas's boot and examined the leg in detail. His fingers moved along the broken places with surprising gentleness. Then he stood and went to one of the shelves and selected something from one of the jars. It was a piece of bone, pale and smooth, about the size of a man's finger. He heated it over a small fire, not like normal fires burn, but something dimmer and greener, and he began to work it into a paste with herbs Silas couldn't identify. The smell was strange, not entirely unpleasant, but not entirely pleasant either. Something old, something that had been waiting a very long time to be used. The bone setter applied this paste to the broken leg with precision, suggesting he'd done this many times before. And the strangest thing happened. The pain began to subside, not all at once, but gradually. Within an hour, Silas was sleeping deeply. He stayed in that hollow for 3 weeks. That's what he thought anyway. It was hard to keep track of time in a place where the sun didn't seem to move through the sky in any normal fashion. The bone setter cared for him with dedication, suggesting he took professional pride in his work. Every morning, or what passed for morning, he would examine the leg and apply new poultices made from bone and herbs. And slowly, impossibly, the leg began to heal. But something else was happening, too. Something Silas didn't quite notice at first because it was so gradual. The bone setter's grafting process wasn't just healing the broken bone. It was replacing it. Silas could feel it. A sensation like small stones shifting beneath the skin, like something being slowly exchanged for something else. When he asked the bone setter about it, the old man would just smile that smile without warmth. You can't put old bone into new flesh and expect nothing to change, the bone setter said. The old bone remembers things, remembers being part of the mountain, and it wants to go back. By the time 3 weeks had passed, the leg was whole again, stronger than it had been before. The bone setter told him he could leave whenever he wanted to. The mountain would guide him back, the old man said. But when Silas tried to leave, he found his body didn't quite respond the way it used to. He felt lighter and colder, and there was a strange sensation in his bones, like ice moving through his veins in slow rhythm. He made it back to civilization, though he would never quite be able to explain the route he took. His supervisor found him 3 days later, wandering on the edge of the county road, barely recognizable. Silas had lost 30 pounds. His skin had taken on a pale grayish quality. His eyes had a strange, distant quality, as if he was looking at the world from a very far distance. The doctors examined him, found nothing physically wrong. His broken leg had healed perfectly, too perfectly. The bone itself had the density of something much older than human bone, something more like stone. Silas told them about the bone setter, but they wrote it down as fever dreams, as delirium brought on by pain and dehydration. But the strangeness didn't end when he left the Marrow-Thicket. The transformation continued. Over the following months, Silas felt himself becoming something other than human. The weight continued to drop away. His body temperature fell so low that his friends became concerned. His appetite diminished until he was eating almost nothing, and his thoughts became slower, dreamier, as if his very mind was being replaced with something that operated on a different frequency. The strange sensation in his bones intensified. It wasn't painful exactly. It was more like his structure was being slowly altered, as if the old bone was spreading through his body like roots growing through soil. He could feel his spine changing, his ribs reshaping themselves, the bones of his fingers lengthening. His friends abandoned him. They said he was sick, that something was terribly wrong. But Silas could feel that nothing was wrong. He was becoming what he was meant to become, and the mountains called to him. Every night he felt the pull of the Marrow-Thicket, like a hook embedded in his chest. The need to return grew stronger with each passing week. He couldn't work, couldn't maintain his apartment, couldn't engage in the normal functions of human life. By the third year, Silas was barely recognizable as human anymore. He'd become something hollow, something light. His skin clung to his bones like paper, and those bones were no longer quite bone. They were something harder, something whiter, something that seemed to reflect light in ways that normal bone never could. And one autumn night, when the mist was rising thick off the creek beds in the Appalachian hills, Silas walked back into the Marrow-Thicket. The trail that had taken him hours to navigate before, he covered as if the mountain itself was carrying him. And he came to the ridge line that overlooks the silent hollow, and he stood there, looking down into the mist, and he understood what had happened to him. He wasn't sick. He was becoming part of the mountain. The old bone that the bone setter had grafted onto him was pulling him back to the place where it had originated, to the stone and the earth from which it had come. He was being slowly reassimilated, slowly absorbed back into the landscape that had never wanted him to leave. He stood on that ridgeline and let the transformation complete itself. The witnesses who found him 3 years later, local hunters who knew better than to venture into the thicket, but ventured there anyway, they said that when they touched him, he felt like stone. His skin was already taking on the color of hemlock bark. His fingers had become like twigs, and in the wind that passes through the pass above the silent hollow, on the cold nights when the mist hangs heavy and the mountains seem to be breathing all around you, well, folks say you can still hear him breathing. A sound like wind moving through hollowed bone. A sound like the mountain speaking to itself. And sometimes, on those cold nights when the mist won't clear, travelers report seeing a figure standing on the ridge above the Marrow-Thicket, watching the trail below, waiting perhaps for the next surveyor who doesn't know the stories, The next young man with his instruments and his confidence, walking down into the hollows where the bone setter is always waiting, always working, always collecting the old bone that the mountain brings to him. Because the mountain, you see, it has a way of taking care of itself. This is case file 079, the Hemlock bone setter. And the next time you hear the mountains breathing, the next time you hear that sound like wind through hollowed bone, well, you might wonder who else is listening in the dark.